welcome back into the Electric Lounge. It is 2021 and it's time to get deeper into these Bs. Tonight we're going to start with this block of vinyl right here, these guys, and that would be the Beatles. Love them, hate them, respect them, think that they're overblown garbage. Well, you're right. The Beatles really did do all of that, and they changed the absolute face of how rock and roll music would forever be looked at from that point forward. Were they the first band or the first, people to ever cause a craze? No, of course not. I'm sure Chopin caused a craze in his day. Probably not quite the same, throwing panties on stage and whatnot, but that might have been later than the Beatles era as well, because I don't think we were to quite the panty-throwing phase yet. But the Beatles were, maybe not the best band, but they were the most important band, and that is just a fact. You can like them or dislike them, but you cannot argue with the fact that they changed everything. And then in their wake, they paved the way for everyone else to change things along the way. Now, did they create rock and roll? Of course not. They played it very safe in the beginning, and they stuck to the roots of rock and roll, and their formula for the first, 5 albums, was very straightforward. A, verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus, out. And it was nothing that special, but at the same time, it was something completely special, and it blew people's minds. Critics obviously panned them at the time, thinking that they were crap, and people still lost their minds. It didn't matter. These 4 long-haired freaks from Liverpool, England, will forever be the face of rock and roll, rebellion, creativity, a bar that has to be reached. If you want to be taken seriously, you got to reach this bar, man. That's just the way it is. So I started with Meet the Beatles, and then moved on to introducing the Beatles. Beatles 65 followed that by Hard Day's Night. For some reason, I do not have the Help album. Don't know what I did with it. Really thought I had it, but it's gone. So these 4 albums are kind of the beginning, the roots of where they were to be, right? So they came out, they started doing their little love me do type stuff and their please please me type stuff. Their shaggy long hair and pissing off moms and dads worldwide, but I'll get to that in a little while. And then they took it to the cinema and made it a completely different thing. So the Beatles movies, I thought, were pretty hysterical, especially Hard Day's Night and Help are pretty funny. They obviously don't know what they're doing acting-wise, but that worked to their advantage, and I found them very funny. Then they started kind of growing their hair out a little longer, getting a little more rebellious, and their song structures started to change a little bit along the way. They became more in-depth, more deep with the lyrics, and more complicated with the chord structures and the actual structure of the song not being so focused and so chiseled into ABA type things. Although this is still fairly straightforward on the album, they did start to progress from the straight, 3-chord, this kind of thing, to getting into different things such as, Norwegian Wood, or Girl, or even Michelle, which is one of my least favorite songs by the Beatles. In fact, if I had to pick a Beatle that I loved, everybody's got their favorite Beatle, right? I can tell you this much, Paul is not my favorite Beatle. I like him, and I did see him live, and he was a great show, but a lot of Paul's songs kind of get to me after a while, especially the later years. But at that point, they started to change a little bit, and then they really started to change. This, most likely after they started hanging out with their dentist and doing that Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, because this is a whole nother level. You can tell just by looking at them in it that they're already kind of getting to that point where they're like, oh yeah, they're partying now, and they're smoking the dope, and they're listening to the psychedelia, and they're thinking, wow, there's so many more things that we can do with this. So George brings in the Middle Eastern type influences and the Buddhist type thing in his teaching from Ravi Shankar and all the Mahavishnu and all those different things that I'm probably saying incorrectly. And John is going more in a philosophical, deep way, and Paul is getting deeper into his love thing. But at the same time, they're broadening as a band. Ringo is somewhere out there going, you know what, I could do something too. And he did. He made some pretty funny songs along the way. I mean, they're a little ridiculous, but hey, it's Ringo, right? But this album is one of my all-time favorite Beatles albums, especially because Tomorrow Never Knows and She Said, She Said. Then they really took it to another level with this. An absolute masterpiece. And as I mentioned in the last video, this is to be directly juxtaposed to the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. Coming from two different angles, coming from two totally different camps, but meeting in the middle in oozing with absolute creativity and things that had never been done at that time. You know, the amount of tracks and such that were put on here, and the manipulation of tape, and the multi-overdubs, and all the things that had not been done yet at this point. And the orchestration, spectacular albums, both of them, and this one is probably one of the most influential albums. Now, what actually caused Paul to conceive this album, according to legend? That would be Frank Zappa's Freak Out album, but that's just what I've heard. Then, at that point, they're like, oh man, we're way too high to bother coming down, so let's get really crazy. And comes the Magical Mystery Tour. This is actually a movie that I have never seen. I don't know why I haven't seen it, but it's something that's been on my list for 35 plus years. But, you know, just to let you guys know, the Walrus was Paul. Then, speaking of influencing, an album that supposedly influenced Charles Manson and the family into doing the Tate murders, etc., etc. All of those murders and his whole idea of Helter Skelter came from the Beatles' White Album. Is that true? I don't know. Do I think that the Beatles actually wrote that to get inside of his head, of Manson's head, and then cause a race war between blacks and whites and not the late 1960s in America? No, I definitely do not. But it definitely happened for Charlie that way, and this album is absolute, hands down, my favorite Beatles album. They had gotten into their extremely weird stuff with Sgt. Pepper's, you know, Magical Mystery Tour, where it was really good stuff, but it was also kind of almost too weird. This reeled it back in, and they kind of spread it out and put it out on the table and said, all right, let's do an album that touches a bit upon everything. There's metal from Helter Skelter. There's extremely lovey, trippy type stuff like Dear Prudence. There's the gritty, why don't we do it in the road? And there's, you know, little piggies playing in the dirt, and it's got a bit of everything. You know, Julia, and it's such a nice combination of all of these different styles that they had built at that point, minus, of course, the extreme Beatle boots, you know, this year's, but it's brilliant album. Absolutely brilliant, including Revolution Number 9, which is one of the weirdest songs ever still to this point, with the tape loops and, you know, all the weird shit going on in there. Backwards messages, do they exist in there? I don't know for sure. I've definitely heard some stuff, like when Paul's screaming, "Right!" Or actually, it might be John. Supposedly, it's Paul screaming, "Let me out," because he was supposed to be dead and actually in the coffin. And in between, what was it, Blackbird and So Tired, it's, you know, the Paul is dead now, miss him, miss him, miss him. Am I just hearing these things, or are they actually there? Well, listen for yourself. Now, why were they saying that? Because supposedly Paul was already dead. That's why he's the only one walking without shoes on, and if you look closely in there, it says 28 if, which supposedly means that Paul would have been 28 years old if he was still alive at that point. Obviously, he's still alive at this point, so we know that didn't really happen. But this being their very last album, but this being their very last release. So this is them in the studio. They're kind of going back to more of a stripped down Beatles, straightforward, recorded live in the studio and just put it out type thing, which is pretty cool. I enjoy that because it's a nice step forward from where they were at on the White Album. Two of Us, Dig a Pony, and I Me Mine. I've Got a Feeling. This is a good album. It's just a fun rock album, and I really like it. And this one, their very last one that they ever actually did, even though it was not their last release, is another purely brilliant album. Abbey Road, of course. The second side of this album in particular, I think, is just spectacular. The whole thing just goes in a nice, perfect, structured sequence that fades out into the Carry That Weight and in the end. And then The Secret, Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she doesn't have a lot to say. It's a great way for a great band to say goodbye. The amount of stuff that they released and accomplished in the short period of time they were together, and the amount of pressure they must have felt during that period of time, is something none of us will ever be able to comprehend. But another million releases came out after that. Of course, you've got this one, which is I like to call the Hey Jude album, because it's got Hey Jude on it, but it's also got a different version of Revolution on it. It's got Paperback Writer on here. It's basically a collection of singles and stuff that didn't make it on the other albums. My favorite being Rain, which was actually covered by the Grateful Dead when I saw them. Well, they covered it many times, but I got to hear them do it at Buckeye Lake in Ohio in 1993, 94, I think. They opened with it. It was magical. Then you've got this one, which is the Beatles Rarities. A bunch of different stuff that they had also, different takes, the mono version, the stereo version, etc., etc. And then you've got a slew of other compilations, and there's a million more than these. These two being the most popular ones, the 62, 66, and 67, 70. How did they accomplish so much in such a short period of time? I mean, if you really think about it, 62 to 70, think about that. Less than 10 years, 8 years, and this band changed the face of everything. It's mind-blowing. And then, you've got all of the different things that tried to copy this, or at least came along with it, with, the Stones and the Beach Boys doing their thing, and then the Who coming off of that, and the Pretty Things coming off of that, and just this, this time during music was the absolute quintessential decade for the evolution of rock and roll, 65 to 75. And I could argue this for hours and give multiple points of why I feel that way, but for this particular point, we'll just move on. Early Beatles was one of them. That was a nice, fun one. And then these I did not listen to at all because they're all on things I've already listened to, of course. So we've got rock and roll, we've got the Beatles love songs, and then one thing that I found that I had was 2 albums that don't have a cover, so I put them in this old Rotary Connection cover that I happen to have a double cover of. And this is called The Beatles Story. Released on Capitol. I believe this probably came out somewhere around 65. I don't even know. I don't remember seeing a date on it. But this has got, it's kind of like a newsreel. The whole thing is like one big newsreel. And it's got them talking about Beatlemania and how all of the craze started. And they interview moms and dads and kids, and they interview John, Paul, George, and Ringo, and there's snippets in here, and there's quotes, and there's them talking about their hair, and you're talking stuff that was only this long at that point. And it gives a really interesting view from a time period when it was still evolving. You can look back now, I can look back and say, wow, this is what they did. I wasn't there, I didn't see it. This is something that happened during it. Take a listen to this little snippet that I put together here. It's a couple different parts put together. You'll get a good idea of what it's all about.
Beatlemania. But what is Beatlemania? Mania, by definition, means craze. We found a label, but we still don't know what's inside the bottle. Beatlemania is, in fact, a temporary state of mind which can only be accurately described by the one who's under its influence.
What did it do to you? You seem to be in a...
They were just like 4 boys, and I really liked them. They were good. They're real great guys. It didn't really hit me. And then you see them standing there singing, and I don't know what they do. They just change you.
Of course, there are sometimes distraught fathers who shake their heads in confused disbelief after watching their daughters wilt under the emotional strain of idol worship.
It's a mob, they're just a part of the mob. I mean, they're monkey see, monkey do, so they come running. That's all, just like a bunch of monkeys,
And let's not forget some of those adult mothers who accompany youngsters to airport fan club rallies.
You look like a housewife. Are you out here to see the Beatles?
Oh, you must be kidding. My husband's coming, and otherwise, do you think I'd fight this motley crew?
But whether you're a fan or a critic, Beatlemania is a reality.
Yeah, so that's it, the Beatles. Like, who knew that those hooligans could change the entire world? And it's mind-blowing. It really is. I mean, we could debate this, but again, it's the Beatles, so it's been debated so many times, there's no need to go any further. So after recording the second part of this video, I decided I'm going to stop here right after the Beatles, because I also get into everything from here to here with the Bees that I've already listened to. So we'll pick up with that with part 3, so I'm out of here. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching The Electric Lounge. I'm Scott Oz, and I'm out. Peace.